Well, apologies to everyone who was hoping to see Bill Mason, chair of the Continuous Cover Forestry Group at this point. Unfortunately, Bill is unable to be with us today, and he's asked me to stand in to chair this webinar. I'm Graham Gill, and I've been a member of the CCFG, well, since it started. Welcome to this CCFG webinar on the subject of regenerative forestry. We have the usual rules, so cameras off and microphones off. And any questions and comments, then please put them in the chat and we'll look at these later. I'm pleased to introduce our special guest today, who's Clive Thomas. Clive Thomas is the Soil Association's Senior Advisor for Forestry, leading on regenerative forestry advice, including the integration of trees and woodland management into farming systems, as well as policy development in response to voluntary carbon and natural capital markets. Clive is a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Foresters and has worked in private and state forestry sectors during a career of more than 30 years, managing forests and developing forest policy. So welcome, Clive, and I'll hand over to you at this point.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, really good to be with the CCFG group this afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen and share some slides with you. Thank you, Graham, for the introduction. As you can see, I'm Clive Thomas. I work as a senior advisor within the farming and land use team for the Soil Association. And perhaps this is going to be a little bit different to some of the other talks that you have within CCFG, because I hope none of you have joined to learn anything about CCF from me, because the people on the call are the people that I would go to be inspired about actually how to implement continuous cover forestry. I think the reason I've been asked to present the work and the report that the Soil Association developed about 2 years ago now is because there's a very strong theme within the report in terms of the benefits that CCF can provide. And for us, it's kind of encapsulates many of the themes and the goals within the regenerative forestry ideas that we've expressed in this report. So, as well as introducing myself, I should just briefly introduce the Soil Association. I'm sure many of you have heard of us. Perhaps you even have forests that are certified by the Soil Association certification team. And I'm sure also some of you are aware of our work, our long-standing work around organic food and farming, for instance. So we're a UK charity that's been around now for over 75 years. And we, interestingly, I think, work across the food, farming and forestry sectors. And over that sort of history, I guess our sort of impact and influence has changed between those three domains. And the reason I want to sort of emphasize that is because that actually partly explains the reason why we produced this regenerative forestry report a couple of years ago. In terms of the way we work, we like to think that we work sort of across the policy and practice spectrum. So very much anything that we do kind of advocacy-wise or campaigning-wise or arguing for change at the policy level is very much informed by some of the other things that we do at a more of a grassroots level. And in that case, in this instance, in relation to this particular report, that would be the work that we do as a forest certification body. But it applies equally in terms of some of our farmer-facing work. So our work and campaigning around agroforestry, for instance, is very much influenced by the work that we do with farmers on the ground. So that's a little bit about the organisation. But why did we decide to invest in this theme of regenerative forestry a few years ago? Because it is a couple of years old now, the report. It was first published in March 22, and it took us about 18 months to develop the thinking and the report itself. And really, there were a few things going on in the organisation at the time that led us to take that decision. But they mostly relate around the fact that we had a new 10-year strategy. And because of our work across food, farming and forestry sectors, and also our sort of deep involvement with voluntary forest certification, both in the UK and internationally now for about 25 years, we recognised in that strategy review that at a sort of advocacy and I guess kind of more policy level, we weren't saying much about forestry. And so we decided to give that a bit of thought and also to, I guess, pick up on some other themes that we detected as an organisation over the last few years, really, where this concept, this term regenerative forestry was starting to be used. And I want to make it really clear that we're not sort of setting out in this report any sort of ownership or claim over regenerative forestry as a term. What we're trying to do in this report is look at an evidence base and put forward a case for, if there is such a thing as regenerative forestry, what does it do? What does it look like? What does it deliver? And we were getting a little bit concerned when we thought about some of the key themes in our strategy around climate, nature and people, that the regenerative word was starting to be used in a bit of a loose sense. Sometimes it might be called greenwashing. So effectively a kind of a rebrand of what's already going on within forestry. Of course, we're growing a renewable resource, therefore it must be regenerative. So I think by sort of developing this report and developing the evidence base for this report, we wanted to put a bit of a stake in the ground and say a bit more about forestry in the UK than perhaps we have done as an organisation in recent times. As I mentioned a few times, we're very active in forest certification. We're actually one of the organisations that helped get FSC off the ground itself more than 30 years ago. But then we've gone down a particular route of providing business services in terms of certification, but not had much to say alongside our sort of farming and food work from an advocacy point in recent times. So this report really was designed to sort of address that and also manage some of those risks that I've highlighted. So how did we go about developing the report? Well, the first thing we did was take quite a deep look at the evidence base. And again, going back to our strategy, where because we're not a single issue charity, we like to join up the dots and try and think about things more from a systems point of view. We wanted to sort of, I guess, take a bit of a cold look at how UK forests are delivering across climate, nature and people, and not sort of pick them off one by one, but try and think about them in the round. So that was very much the lens that we worked with. And just to kind of do a bit of a shout out to somebody that did a lot of work for us on this report as a researcher rather than as a member of staff, but Robin Walter, who some of you may know, was the lead researcher and a contributing author to the eventual reports that we published. And really the work that Robin did in the end was so comprehensive that we ended up producing 2 reports. So if you follow the links to our website, you'll find the main report, Regenerative Forestry, Forestry and Forests for the Future. But alongside that, you'll find more of a technical annex, which we called the evidence. There is some overlap between the two, but in the evidence report, you'll see the more than 140 references that in the end we sort of used as a synthesis to come up with some of the sort of key conclusions and kind of some of the key thoughts in terms of what regenerative forestry could be going forwards. So that's the report and the evidence base. And I obviously don't have time to take you through the reports in detail, but just to kind of try and summarize, I guess, how we started to think about this once we'd done the evidence review. We started, classic way of doing these things. We started to think about some of the opportunities, but also some of the challenges. So first of all, the opportunities, and this was, as I say, first published in 2022, but I think they're just as relevant in 2024 as they were 2 years ago. And I think we know, all of us working within this sector know that there's kind of a huge amount of interest in trees, both sort of politically and from a citizen perspective. If you look back to the last general election, the politicians were falling over themselves in terms of how interested they were in trees. We know at a local level that trees and woodlands and forests can be hugely engaging to citizens and hugely relevant to citizens. So that has to be an opportunity. I think the policy consensus that there is now across all of the countries of the UK around the need for more woodland also has to be an opportunity. And of course, one of the key products from forestry we know has a huge role to play as a climate-friendly material. So again, that has to be an opportunity. I think generally we're working in quite a buoyant sector. That sometimes plays out in less positive ways in terms of skills gaps, but in terms of opportunities, both kind of for individuals and organisations, but also the sector as a whole. As Graham said, I've been working in forestry now for more than 30 years, and it's definitely quite a buoyant time. And in some senses, we're in a reasonable place in terms of some of the kind of benchmarks, I guess, for how we judge responsible forestry, sustainable forestry, in that most of the timber producing forests in the UK are FSC or PFC certified through the Aquas scheme. And that's obviously where Soil Association certification has been very active in terms of providing business services. But what about some of the challenges that the report highlighted? And as I say, we were looking at this through the lens of climate, nature, and health, and some of these sort of play out in those different domains. So although I think we can say that there's a very strong case for trees, the public perception of forestry as an industry and as a profession is not so positive. And I think one of the sort of challenges for all of us is to ask ourselves why that is. From a nature perspective, our ecological condition of our woodlands is still pretty woeful. For native woodlands, only about 1% of our native woodlands are in good ecological condition. For our planted woodland, it's only about 7%. Now, some of that's a function of age, but that's perhaps also some of that's a function of how we manage our woodlands. And then, of course, we have the long-standing issue of undermanagement, particularly of our small woodlands. That hasn't really shifted in my time in forestry. We've bemoaned that state of undermanagement of our small woodlands consistently for the last several decades. And then some might argue that there's overmanagement of some of our commercial woodlands in terms of how intensively they're managed and the way that they're managed. And again, that's a challenge. Set aside against all those things is that we're obviously still very reliant on timber imports. So there has to be, putting that challenge together with some of those other challenges on that screen about undermanagement and perception of forestry, there has to be an opportunity there. And despite that sort of huge interest in trees and that policy consensus around woodland creation, most of those tree planting targets are not being met, with the notable exception of Scotland in more recent times, although even in Scotland, things have become much more challenging. So as we started to think about sort of turning the evidence base and some of those kind of headlines into set of thinking for the future around regenerative forestry, again, we started to sort of encapsulate some of those challenges in particular in terms of policy problems. And I'm just highlighting a few here on this slide and just talk you through a few of these, which I've already sort of touched on really. But, you know, why, you know, we have to ask ourselves the question, why is it that despite, you know, citizens' love of trees, universal sort of support politically for increasing woodland cover, we've consistently failed to achieve that? You know, why is that? Can we take some clues from some of the other things that the report is highlighting? And then a second problem around, and I'll come on to this in a moment, you know, we have had a framework for sustainable forest management, responsible forest management, whether that's a regulatory framework in terms of the UKFS, whether that's a voluntary framework in terms of voluntary forest certification. You know, they've been around for a while now. They've been around for most of my career, a 30-year paradigm of multi-purpose forestry. But some of those issues around woodland condition still haven't really shifted. Why is that? And then, you know, another one that I'm highlighting on this slide here in terms of problem 3, again, perhaps in the last couple of decades, there's been, in a policy discussion, there's been much more talk about the multiple benefits that trees, woodlands, forestry can provide, and using the sort of framework of ecosystem services or natural capital values, whichever sort of framework or language we look to choose, from a kind of policy perspective and a sort of research perspective, these things get quantified and credited. But from a forest manager's perspective and a forest owner's perspective, the market signals haven't really changed. You know, the main way of earning any money from woodland management is through timber sales. So, you know, again, that's something that needs to be addressed, and maybe regenerative forestry thinking can help with some of that. So don't worry, I'm going to be more optimistic in a moment, but I'm just kind of outlining some of the sort of thinking that went into the report to get to where we got to. So I guess the sort of key conclusion that we reached based on the work that we did was that, you know, to realise that full opportunity and the full potential for UK forestry, it's not really a business as usual model. We do need some new thinking. We do need some real change. We do maybe need to start thinking about more of a paradigm around regenerative forestry, and so maybe just to sort of face into that point I made earlier, really, about the paradigm that's been there for the last 30 years. You know, why isn't it sustainable enough? You know, I think it's important to sort of reflect back to how both the UKFS and voluntary forest certification came about in the first place. They were effectively responses to the Earth Summit in '92 and the sort of failure politically at a UN level to have a convention on forestry. And then there was kind of a policy response to, you know, well, how do the UN forest principles get enshrined into national regulations, and then that also led to the rise of the voluntary forest certification movement. But it was really on the back of trying to stop bad stuff happening, particularly during the 80s. It wasn't necessarily about building back or a regenerative idea of restoring and restoration. Now, it's fair to say that particularly in forest certification, the requirements have shifted. They have started to move more in the direction of building back and restoration. But really, they were those frameworks were put in place to put in place a sort of baseline requirement to things. And some would argue that they were never really designed to set a vision for forestry at any national level, and that applies equally to the UK. And the reality of how these things change in terms of kind of multi-stakeholder movements is that you need things like the thinking that we're trying to inject into the conversation around regenerative forestry and similar initiatives from other organisations to actually get that sort of bottom-up shift to how national standards get set for forest certification, and how the UKFS perhaps gets amended in its future versions. So from our perspective, we took the view that we needed an enhanced approach that really kind of starts to hardwire some of these themes of restoration, resilience, integration, engagement, and reward, which I'm going to come on to now, into the system to actually get that change and to realise that potential. So I guess at the sort of heart of the report are five goals that we've sort of set out, because I think in the end we concluded that regenerative forestry, and that title we ended up giving this report, was a collection of things really that kind of applies at a land use level, applies at a policy level, but also might apply at an individual woodland or forest level. And the goals that we set out in the report tried to pick up on some of that thinking. So the first sort of goal is that we need to do some of the things that we try to do in the Soil Association kind of more consistently in terms of how we manage forests and take forward some of the sort of policy thinking around forestry. We need to always be mindful that this is a whole system approach, or that we need to adopt a whole system approach. So what that means really is that not just at the individual forest level, but also at the landscape level, but also what goes on outside the forest. So the products and benefits that derive from forests, and thinking about that alongside the impacts within the forest of delivering those products and benefits. So the first goal really is around that sort of idea of adopting a whole system approach. The second goal or theme is around integration, and particularly integration, land use integration, and kind of land management integration in the true sense of the word. So for us, that really plays out around how forests and trees are much more effectively integrated into the management of the dominant land use in the UK, which is farming, and really trying to put much more in the foreground the idea that farmers have got a big role to play in terms of farm scale forestry, because we've kind of lost that connection completely in the UK. It's still there in many other countries around the world. It's quite understood that in many other countries around the world, whether developing countries but also developed countries, that farmers are some of the principal growers of trees, principal suppliers of timber. That theme has completely been disconnected in the UK in the last century, really. And we could historically analyse why that's been, but we've basically backed from a policy perspective a large-scale model of forestry, and we think that needs to be addressed, both for the benefits of forestry and what that can give to society, but also to the benefits of farming. So that's the second theme around integration. The third one is really about the forests themselves, and that we need to give the forests themselves the tools really to be resilient and diverse, and adaptive to climate change, and really to function as an ecosystem, so that the sort of benefits that they can give for climate, nature and people can continue to be provided into the long term, and that forests can behave much more as ecosystems through that diversity of species, age class, etc. And then the fourth theme is around, and quite linked to the third theme really, but the idea of climate, nature and people friendly management practices. And I think, with that third goal and theme that I introduced and this one, that's really where some of the thinking in the report around CCF being a go-to system to deliver some of these benefits consistently and universally across forests has much to offer. And then the final sort of goal really is that we do achieve improved public perception, and that sort of universal love of trees does translate into meeting our woodland restoration objectives in future, and perhaps a changed perception of forestry, and maybe even a sort of a reclaiming of the forestry word, really, so that it becomes a bit more sort of universal to some of the themes in this report, rather than in many citizens' minds being prescribed around a particular style of forestry. But crucially also that approach really, that woodland managers and woodland owners are properly supported and rewarded for what benefits their forests and their woodlands can deliver, rather than just being consistently told all these benefits are coming from forestry, but really the market signal remaining timber. Okay, so sort of moving on through the slides and trying to sort of summarize a few things. In the report, we kind of forced ourselves to think, well, what does regenerative forestry look like in practice? And a very influential one of the very influential papers that we reviewed in the evidence section was this a report from Forest Research, actually, regarding an analysis of the impact of forest management approaches on the relative supply of ecosystem services. Now, I don't know whether you can see it clearly on the screen, but essentially it's a graph that has different ecosystem services, and the amount of their supply on the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal axis, it plots different intensities of forest management. And you can kind of see that there's a sweet spot in terms of where fibre, carbon, biodiversity, health, recreation, water and flood protection, which are the ones that were analysed in this report, look like they're being optimised. And the two management systems that were analysed in this report that optimise those ecosystem services were described in the report as close to nature and combined objective. And I think there's some really sort of important distinctions in this paper and in this slide. So close to nature, I think maybe the analogue for that would be continuous cover forestry, although I suspect many people on this call would argue that the fibre production from continuous cover forestry is actually much more optimistic than perhaps this diagram presents. And then the other one to sort of analyse is the combined objective, which sometimes might just be taken as a sort of simple, well, isn't that what we've been doing through multi-purpose forestry? But it specifically talks about not adopting too much of a zoned approach to how multi-purpose forestry is implemented. And I think we're making the case in this report that quite a lot of our response to multi-purpose forestry has been based on very much a zoning response. So we've effectively kind of disaggregated forests and said, this bit's for people, this bit's for nature, this bit's for timber production. That isn't what combined objective management is. Combined objective is where you're trying to optimize different benefits on the same hectare and in the same part of the forest. So, effectively, it was some of this sort of evidence base that really led us to the conclusion that CCF has a massive role to play, already is having a role to play in regenerative forestry, but has a much more significant role to play going into the future. But another sort of key theme that sort of emerged from our work and was also quite linked to some work, kind of wider work that the Soil Association had already been doing around integrating trees into farming systems, was that regenerative forestry also needs to be thought about and play out much more at a farm scale. In fact, farm scale forestry would be an example of a regenerative forestry system if it really adopted a kind of whole system approach. So what I mean by that is the trees are truly integrated into the farming system, and any woodland on the farm is truly integrated into the farm enterprise. And they would be examples then of regenerative forestry approaches. And the reason for thinking in that way goes back to some of that evidence base that I presented earlier about the missed opportunities in terms of undermanagement, missed opportunities for timber products, missed opportunities for biodiversity, missed opportunities for the rural economy. And also goes back to one of those other policy problems that I highlighted, which is, why is it so contested, tree planting in the UK, if we all love trees and there's policy consensus around it and the grants are reasonably good? It's because we have to find a new model of taking the majority landowner and land managers with us in terms of much more of this being implemented as part of a carrying on farming solution rather than a replacing farming solution. So to have credibility for more tree planting on farms, we have to be much more serious about the woodland and forestry that's already there. So again, we've been active in this space since the main regenerative forestry report was published in 2022. We've launched this case for regenerative farm scale forestry at the agroforestry show last year. And we've done some other sort of evidence reviews and some other sort of advocacy around trees and woodlands in the farm landscape. So we did a major sort of evidence report working with Cumulus, which was again finalised towards the end of 2022. And then, as I say, we've produced some advocacy to support our wider work really on agroforestry in more recent times. Okay, to just go back to the main regenerative forestry report, the sort of final section was some of the recommendations. We weren't presenting this as a strategy. We're really presenting it as a sort of thought leadership report, to get a conversation going, to sort of facilitate a discussion, and as I said earlier, to put a few stakes in the ground from the point of view of the Soil Association, that if we are going to start circulating around this term, it needs to mean something, and it needs to mean something different. But we did get as far as proposing some high-level recommendations for three audiences, really. So for government and policymakers, forest owners, forest managers, and the forest product industries, but also to challenge ourselves as well, and some of the, I guess some of our partners in the civil society organisations on this. And again, I don't have time to go through the full set of recommendations in the report. You can read those for yourselves. But just to sort of highlight a few for government and policymakers, this idea of much more of a sort of joined up policy framework. And interestingly, I think we've started to see the semblances of this as post-CAP farm support starts to get developed. It's definitely starting to integrate across the divide between farming and forestry. Still a long way to go, but some baby steps on that. And maybe linked to that might be some genuinely new incentives and signals to people who manage land, farmers, foresters, forest managers, in terms of actually how we're going to reward for climate, nature, and people impacts. I think we've still got a long way to go in the third one in terms of better aligning research and technical development to support forest owners to transition to regenerative forestry management practices. I mean, maybe that's a question to all of you on the call as CCF practitioners and experts. It feels to us like you're having to make some of this work kind of on a shoestring without full support. And if you kind of juxtapose that with the government investment that there was for a particular model of forestry during the 20th century, have we really kind of fully aligned our research and technical development to support a different model of forestry going forward, whether that's small-scale, farm-scale forestry, or whether that's continuous cover forestry management. And we also think there's a particular challenge for government-owned forests, not just the exemplar sites that are the ones that the public see and politicians get taken to, but the much more extensive estate that's out there, and the opportunity to fully embrace regenerative forestry and do combined objective management across much more significant area of that forest. I think the recommendations of governments and policymakers really sort of do precede anything that we might want to say to forest owners or forest managers or forest product industries, because a lot of this is about those policy and other signals. But really, you know, we think there is a challenge there for the sector to much more extensively adopt regenerative forest management practices. CCF are moving away from that zoned approach. We really do need a step change in species diversity and in stand age structure. I think 25% of our growing stock is still Sitka spruce, mostly even aged, you know, and we still have a lot of undermanaged woodland that isn't working as hard enough as it could do in terms of climate, nature, and people. And also that sort of, I guess, the responsibility of those of us within the forestry sector to, you know, find ways of working across and integrating across into farming. Okay, I think the final slide from me before I thank you all for listening, but just to briefly outline what next for the Soil Association. So what have we been doing since the report was published in 22? In many ways, actually, this presentation to CCFG has come relatively late in the process. We've been making presentations and doing some advocacy and awareness raising around this report for a couple of years now, and we're going to continue to do that. We don't have a huge amount of campaigning resource within the charity to do that. There's a handful of us that are involved, but we're going to continue to take those opportunities. Where we have been particularly active is around farm-scale forestry and integrating trees and woodlands into the farming system and farming enterprises. You'll be aware of our wider work on agroforestry. We have a huge number of sort of farmer, but also hopefully increasingly forester-facing resources to support on that on our website and in our sort of general materials. The report that we published or launched at the Agroforestry Show last year, work we've been doing around groundswell and the sort of regenerative farming movement. We've got a particular project that's being funded by the Forestry Commission at the moment in England around the concept of whole farm tree planning and how we can come up with much more of a sort of functional condition assessment for woodland on farm and the treescape on the farm in terms of how it's supporting farming and might be more optimized to support those benefits. So we're very active in that area. We continue to be really interested in innovative ways to reward forest managers, just in the same way that we're interested in how farmers might be rewarded for improving soil condition, but that applies just as much in the forest and also wider woodland ecological condition as well. We're interested in, as I say, we're not the experts. We don't claim to be the experts in continuous cover management forestry, but we are very interested in giving others and expert groups like CCFG and others a platform to help build capacity. So again, any thoughts that any of you have got on how to practically do that, we certainly take the opportunity when we've got the opportunity to do it with policymakers. But we would like to see a lot more happen around that sort of capacity building and that technical support for some of the things that practitioners are actually trying to do. Okay, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. Well, yes, I think I probably ought to stop. And thank you all for listening. And I think we're going to have some questions and feedback now, Graham. I'll stop sharing my screen, shall I?
You can stop sharing your screen. Yes, thank you. Well, thanks very much, Clive, for describing the report comprehensively. And I think the report that you have described recognises that CCF fits very well with the concept of regenerative forestry, and equally that regenerative forestry, as described by you, fits very well with the concept of CCF, whether it's improving soil health, increasing biodiversity, water management, carbon sequestration, and increasing resilience to climate change. And can I say to everyone, do please put questions and comments into the chat. Looking at the chat, I see we do have a question from Ben Clinch. And Ben, I'll ask you in a minute just to unmute and put on your camera if you can. But really, it's a question about can a forest be all things to all people? And Clive mentioned a sweet spot that optimizes all objectives. And I think, Ben, your question's really along these lines.
Yeah, it is. So I'm in the dark here. Yeah,
we can hear you.
I guess it's just looking at some articles in the Farming Press a couple of days ago, and they were actually arguing the opposite, was to get 30 by 30, was to intensify some agriculture and forestry, and that was to make space for more nature and more carbon. And looking at the evidence they were citing from Cambridge University, I was going to ask if the evidence base from forest research is clear, because it's contested. Well, it is contested. So yeah, I'm speaking as a proponent, as a practitioner of multifunctional continuous cover forestry and doing forestry agro, if you like, rather than agroforestry. But you've got to look at both sides of the argument, and I just wonder how clear that evidence base is when you get things like that from the coming out at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, I mean, I obviously completely understand that challenge and that kind of debate between land sparing and land sharing. And obviously the evidence, it's like any scientific sort of discussion, there's evidence on both sides. I think from the Soil Association's perspective, and it fits with our kind of wider thinking on agroecology, what some of those scientific reviews sometimes ignore are some of those kind of more joined up things that I was trying to talk about in the report. So public perception and the kind of people angle on all this. And you could characterize what's going on with intensive farming as being, those people, the more you go down that intensive route, the more you get boxed in. And perhaps also, either from a forestry perspective or a farming perspective, are you really taking citizens with you if you argue for the kind of land sparing approach, where you're intensifying nature, but you're intensifying everything else as well? And it is a debate, and I can, from a Soil Association perspective, we're very firmly in the land sharing camp.
Yeah, just to cut in on that, though, that it was a discussion had by Rebecca Wrigley of Rewilding Britain as well. So she was asking the question whether intensifying productive agriculture and forestry was a better way to achieve their rewilding aims too. So it's not just agriculture, but having that chin scratch.
Yeah.
So I guess meanwhile, we're a slow-moving forestry policy, slow-moving forestry policy. We're like an oil tanker, aren't we? And we can only be, we can only move as fast as we can, and politics, can move. The right answer in a political debate can change 3 or 4 times in a forest rotation, can't it? So,
I mean, the other thing that I think maybe I didn't emphasize enough in my sort of presentation of the report, but hopefully comes through if you read the full report, and certainly something that's kind of influenced me over the years in my career from the practitioners, is some of the sort of strongest CCF advocates I've come across argue it from a timber perspective and a timber value perspective. And then, the kind of biodiversity and the the wider ecosystem service benefits come along as kind of secondary priorities. But a lot of what they're doing is driven by avoiding the sub-optimization of clear felling, which is what it is. It's a suboptimal system, isn't it? You're felling lots of small trees, and trying to sort of add value to the timber that is grown in a CCF system. So I think that's really interesting territory to explore, really. And is it possible to still have that kind of intensification, certainly of value, in more of our forests, in terms of the timber that's produced from them? But as I say, I think others on the call would have a probably more expert view on whether I'm just being naive. But as I say, I've heard some, very key CCF practitioners make the case from a timber perspective many times.
Yeah, I think in terms of land sharing and land sparing, it's about not ignoring any of the objectives anywhere, but you possibly still have to give more weight to some objectives in some circumstances, and I'm not sure that you can just weight every objective equally everywhere. So maybe there's still some sort of zoning to it, but not to the extent of ignoring some of the purposes of forestry.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Graham. I think we're just kind of setting up that, have we gone too far with zoning rather than zoning not necessarily being relevant, as we all know, land has different capabilities as well, different challenges. Site is key.
Okay, thanks, Clive. When you were talking about regenerative forestry and agroforestry, do you think the concept of regenerative forestry is one that can help farmers to plant more trees to get more interested in forestry?
Well, I think if some of those sort of key themes that we're setting out in the report around the benefits that it can give to the farming system, it feels to me like that's one of the only ways through, really. If we're to see our woodland area increase, it's going to have to be much more through a continuing farming model rather than a replacement of farming model. And one of the key ways of doing that would be for the tree bit of the farm to be fully add value, both to the other things that are going on the farm, the crop production and the livestock production, but also in terms of the products themselves that could come from those systems.
Okay, thanks.
So I think that's why we're so keen on it as an organisation, is to try and find a way through that, really.
Not seeing any more questions in the chat at the moment. So I think I'll say thank you very much, Clive, for that presentation, and it's good to see such a close overlap between CCF and regenerative forestry, and I think both pushing in the same direction. So thank you, Clive, and we'll bring this webinar to an end at this point.